Lovely. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you to an event that actually is kind of the exception that proves the rule to the bulk of the insiders outsiders related events that some of you, I noticed some familiar names, will have attended in the past. As I think many of you will know, the Insiders Outsiders project was initiated and continues to exist to pay tribute to the rich and pervasive and long-lasting, ever-present contribution of the refugees from Nazi Europe to British culture. But I probably don't have to tell most of you that most of them were of German speaking, whether they were from Austria or Germany or indeed elsewhere, but of assimilated, not particularly religiously observant, acculturated, affluent bourgeois background. The subject of our talk today is very different, and I think I probably don't have to say more than that. But one thing that I have been very struck by in my own sort of researches in this terrain is that actually very little attention has been paid to the not insignificant number of refugees from Nazism from a very different, that is to say, a Yiddish speaking, not particularly affluent, religiously observant background, such as Avram Stencl and indeed Joseph Herman himself, whose son David is going to be presiding over this event much more than me from a few minutes onwards. So I think, it's terrain worth exploring, and I look forward to hearing more and discovering more as a result of today's session. It's my very, I'm particularly looking forward to this event, I'll just say quite sort of personally and honestly, partly for that reason, because I'm keen to know more, and I think a lot of people will be too. Also because I had the great pleasure and honor of knowing the wonderful Joseph Herman, who, as I've already said, came from a very similar background to Stencl, and also to have a chance to hear Rachel, who I've known and admired for many a long year. We go back, don't we, Rachel, to the 1990s when we were working on the Rubies and Rebels project together, and you've gone on to do some wonderful and really interesting, unusual things. So it's my great pleasure to have roped you into this. Lovely. Now you all know the ropes. If you wouldn't mind making sure that you're all muted while Rachel and David are talking. We are recording the event, so if you'd like to be rendered invisible, then turn off your cameras. Perhaps I should also say, just while we remember, that Rachel has unfortunately had some quite severe back trouble, so she may need at various points in her talk to disappear for a moment, visually speaking, to get up and move around. So you'll pardon her for that, I'm sure. Very good. So without further ado, I will introduce David, who will be responding to Rachel before we open up the session to a Q&A. Let me just admit a few more people. There we go. David, I suspect, is familiar to many of you, but let me just recap the salient points. He was a TV producer for 20 years and more, and has more recently written about art, literature, and Jewish cultural and other issues for a wide range of prestigious publications. As I've mentioned, as you will know, perhaps, he is the son of the Polish-Jewish refugee artist Joseph Herman, who was a very close friend of Avram Stencl. I should just add that a wonderful exhibition of Joseph's work took place at Flowers Gallery in Kingsland Road in late 2019, early 2020, just at the end of the year-long nationwide official Insiders Outsiders Festival, of which, this event is a kind of virtual sort of offshoot. He has, much to my sort of delight and benefit, he's been closely involved with the Insiders Outsiders project from the very start, and I'm very grateful to David for his support and always interesting input. Good, so over to you, David, over to you.
Thank you so much, Monica. Rachel Lichtenstein hardly needs any introduction, but Avram Stencl, I fear, probably does. Rachel is a writer, artist, and archivist who explores place, memory, and Jewish identity. In 1999, I beg your pardon, she wrote an extraordinary book, Rudinsky's Room, with Ian Sinclair, part cultural history, part detective story. And if you haven't read it yet, I cannot recommend it more highly. And since then, her books have included Rudinsky's Whitechapel, On Brick Lane, and Estuary. Rachel has recently been working on the Yiddish poet Avram Stencl, who happened to be a long-time friend of my father's. Both were Polish Jewish refugees, both were passionate about Yiddish. My father once described going with Stencl to the Tate Gallery. Before entering the room with the Cézanne's, Degas, etc., he stopped for a moment, took off his hat, bowed his head, and quietly murmured, "Respect for the masters." Then he entered the room. He performed this little ceremony with such sincerity that I felt I should bow my head before him. Rachel is going to speak about Stencl for about 40 minutes. And then she and I will talk for about 10 minutes or so. And then we'll open things up to questions from all of you. So without further ado, Rachel on Stencl.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen. One second. Can everybody see that?
Perfect. Yes, that's good, Rachel.
Okay, wonderful. In 1965, Bill Fishman called Stencl the last of the great dreamers of the ghetto who are slowly disappearing from the East End. 18 years later, he was found collapsed on the streets of Whitechapel, dressed like a beggar, penniless, practically unknown. He died shortly afterwards in hospital. Bill said Kaddish at his funeral, and still, until he died, could not talk about it without tears in his eyes. That he should end his days like this is such a tragedy. We have forgotten London's foremost Yiddish poet. I first heard his name in my grandparents' house in Westcliff, or Whitechapel-on-Sea, as many called it. My grandparents and Stencl have been great friends. They met in Whitechapel and shared a mutual passion for Yiddish language. After the war, like many others, my grandfather moved the family from the bombed out streets of East London, and their new home in Essex became a refuge and a meeting place for the artists, poets and radicals of the Jewish East End, and Stencl regularly visited their seaside home. My father remembers seeing him on many occasions, sitting in their front room, arguing passionately, laughing, playing cards, talking of art, politics and friends. He was like a warm and affectionate uncle, said my father, who'd pinch my cheeks vigorously and speak to me at great speed in Yiddish. I only ever understood half of what he told me. He always bought flowers for my mother, who adored him. And as soon as he arrived, she put a plate piled high with steaming hot food in front of him, whilst lamenting at the holes in his jumper and his fingerless gloves. To her, it was a mitzvah to feed him, and an honor to have such a great man in her house. As far as my grandfather was concerned, Stencl was a genius. He told me, for Stencl, poetry was the most important thing in his life. And I thought that was the most romantic thing I had ever heard. Half-remembered details about him fueled my teenage fantasies of the Jewish East End. Determined to discover this landscape for myself, I moved there after finishing a fine art degree at Sheffield University in 1991. And during many years, I spent tracing the last remnants of Jewish Whitechapel. My fascination for Stencl grew. It seemed impossible to talk of the Jewish East End without hearing about him. Elderly people I met remembered him with the greatest affection, calling him a brilliant poet, a real gentleman, a righteous person who never walked past a beggar without giving him something, a legend. Over time, I filled box files with newspaper articles, recorded interviews, images, and stories about his life. And from these varied sources, I began to construct a brief biography. Avram Nachum Stencl was born in 1897 in Szelan, a small mining town in southern Poland. He was descended from a long line of ultra-Orthodox rabbis. He attended yeshiva and grew up in an atmosphere steeped in Jewish learning. But early on, he knew he wanted to be a poet. In 1917, he left with his father's blessing after receiving his military call-up papers. And soon after, he moved to Holland and joined a Zionist community aiming to immigrate to Palestine and become a pioneer. Personality clashes forced him to leave the community, and he began traveling the German countryside, living and working with peasants, writing poetry about the people and the landscape. Oh, sorry about the quality of that slide. Later, in 1921, he moved to Berlin, the same time as Franz Kafka and his lover, Dora Diamond. Stencl and Dora both came from ultra-Orthodox Hasidic communities in the same area of Poland. In Berlin, they met regularly at the Romanische Cafe. Stencl said, "For those fleeing from the pogroms in the Jewish Ukrainian shtetls, from the famine of Russian cities, and from the revolution, a kind of Jewish colony formed itself in the west of Berlin, and the Romanische Cafe was its parliament." Berlin was buzzing with famous Jewish intellectuals and activists, well-known Jewish lawyers from Moscow and Petersburg, Yiddish writers from Odessa and Kiev, with party leaders from the extreme left to the extreme right wing. It buzzed as in a beehive, said Stencl. He stayed in Berlin for 15 years, writing poetry and publishing many books in the 1920s and 30s. He achieved recognition from the literary elite, one of his greatest admirers being Thomas Mann. He lived a bohemian cafe life, had an intense relationship with expressionist poet Elske Laschke-Schuler, who was 28 years older than him. He slept rough on park benches and friends' floors, wrote intensively, and took occasional jobs as a farmhand or working in a cemetery. In 1936, he was allegedly arrested by the Gestapo for being a communist. When released, he escaped to England. There are a number of different versions of this story that I've heard. He was possibly smuggled inside a coffin by an athlete from the Berlin Olympics, or through the help of former German schoolteacher Elisabeth Wohler, who learnt Yiddish, translated much of his poetry, and left him all of her money on her death in 1974. When talking about Germany, Stencl said, "I loved the country. I walked and talked with philosophers and poets of all faiths. Then Hitler came with his storm and hatred, and that is all I want to remember now." His first English home was in Hampstead, where he may have gone to meet up with his old friend Dora. He said, "I didn't like the attitude of the Jews there. We were hearing about the pogroms in Poland and the Troubles, and they carried on laughing and going about their business. So I took a taxi and said, 'Take me to Whitechapel.' The driver was Jewish and we conversed in Yiddish. And when I saw Whitechapel, the streets, the people, I felt like I was coming home. The driver helped me find a room and I've lived here ever since." Stencl arrived in Whitechapel just before the war. Coming from richly cultural Berlin, Whitechapel may have disappointed, but he loved the place passionately. The vibrant Jewish street life, markets, cafes, Yiddish theatre and people became the inspiration for much of his poetry. He called Whitechapel his holy acres, his shtetl, his Jerusalem in Britain. And soon after his arrival, he began to publish Lauschen Laban, Language and Life, a monthly journal of Yiddish writings and poems that he edited, produced, and was a major contributor to. And this publication became his spiritual, intellectual, and physical lifeline and lasted for 43 years, spanning the time of the most intense Jewish life in Whitechapel and also the breakup of its cultural community. Israel Naroditsky, who ran a commercial printing business on the Mile End Road, printed the journal for free, being a great admirer of his work. During the war, when bombing stopped publication of other Yiddish papers, most Yiddish writers in England published in Lauschen Laban. Here we see Stencl standing behind the great Victorian printing press at Narodz, watching the latest edition come to life. Material success meant nothing to him. He lived on his pension. The only important thing that the magazine was published in time. During all those years, Whitechapel Jewry fundamentally changed. The close-knit community disbanded and most left the area, but Stencl remained. His obsession was to keep Yiddish alive. His melancholy poetry reflects the slow death of Whitechapel Jewry. And here I'm reading a part of one of his poems from that time in translation. These poor streets, not much is left of them. Not only the lampposts, but the very roadways are gone. And in the last little synagogue, they look for the 10th man to say Kaddish with some bereaved son. The father is dead, the children divorced from the needle. Over their books, all the time bent low, gone to Stamford Hill, Golders Green, Cricklewood. With a strong hand soon, the last remnant will go. Stencl survived financially from the money he made selling his magazine. He was a familiar face outside the meeting places, the cafes, and the lecture halls, crying koyfts heft, buy a pamphlet, buy a pamphlet. And his constant presence at these events made him a familiar face. Over the years that I've been researching Stencl, I've interviewed a number of people who knew the man, which sadly I never did. And I want to play you now a short clip of one of those people, Bob Chat, talking about his memories of Stencl.
I remember seeing Stencl selling his magazine, the Lauschen and Laban. I only remember him outside, but he was so charismatic and so insistent that you buy a magazine and that you come and support his Saturday afternoon group. That I remember him distinctly. Oh, he was an older man. He was thin, shabby, I'm afraid. I can see his overcoat. He had a traditional man's overcoat, a gray one, an old gray overcoat. But every pocket was packed with scraps of paper, and that was his office. He used to say, "My bureau, that's my office." And every pocket, the two inside pockets, the two great big ones, were packed with bits of paper that he had probably been working on drafts for his poetry. Other people's work probably went in the left-hand pocket, that sort of thing.
It's lovely hearing those voices. Some described him like a beggar. His work became humiliating as the community that supported him died away, said Emanuel Litvinov. Many remember him sat at the table in Lyon's tea shop, scribbling away on a notebook, or walking the streets of Whitechapel, tipping his hat to everyone he met. He was deeply loved and achieved an almost guru-like status. His appearance, ethics, and the sound of his voice reminded people of the old world they'd left behind. And his dedication to the preservation of Yiddish made him a legend. The continuity of the Yiddish language, his personal mission. During the war, with the help of Dora Diamond, Stencl established the literary Saturday afternoon meetings, now known as the Friends of Yiddish. Communists, anarchists, Bundists, Zionists, the Orthodox and the secular, famous writers and factory workers all attended these celebrated gatherings. Stencl managed somehow to keep this varied mix of speakers unified. He began the meetings with a loud bang of his fist on the table promptly at 3, and then a short speech often based on current affairs or something from the Talmud or Kabbalah. Guest writers came from abroad to read. Others performed the great Yiddish classics, sung songs, or discussed politics. No subject was taboo, as long as it was discussed in Yiddish. A lot of these details I found out from the late Meyer Gdansky. who I interviewed a number of times before he sadly died some years ago. And after Stencl died, Maya took over as the chairman of the Friends of Yiddish. And here is a short audio clip of Maya talking about some of those early meetings.
There was the Friends of Yiddish. This was founded by Avram Nachum Stencl. He came from Poland, from a place called Sosnowiec. To this country, he came from Germany. In 1920, he emigrated to Germany. And in 1936, he came to London. And he lived here until he died. When I came to London, and there was a big hall with our stage. When I came there, I had to stand by the wall. And then Stencl told me, he put down 250 chairs. And people had to stand there by the wall, so many people. So slowly it diminished in numbers.
Wonderful memories there from the late Maya Gdansky. As you can tell from that short audio clip, in the old days, Maya said the meetings were absolutely full to capacity. And then he told me after the meetings, they used to go en masse to one of the tea places and chew the whole thing over. Really heated discussion for many hours. We took the program to pieces, he said, more tea and then another 2 hours talking, arguing, discussing ideas. There were masses of these tea places, particularly on the commercial road, but we most often went to Lyons, a huge place near Aldgate Station where Stencl wrote his poetry. Stencl was a poet, and you have to think about that when you read his poems, he said. He writes about many things, an awful lot about love, and when he writes about love, it's with real passion. Maya composed music to a number of his poems, and he told me, like my grandfather said, that Stencl lived for his literary works. Sorry. And just a little bit more here from Maya, talking about the difference between the two of them. He told me, like everybody that I've spoken to who knew him, how charismatic he was. He attracted people to him, but he also said he had a temper and would curse vehemently in Yiddish if someone wronged him, but he didn't hold a grudge. Maya said we came from the same part of Poland, but from really different backgrounds. His family were learned Talmudists, mine were working people. I came from a long line of cabinet makers. He came from a long line of rabbis. So we have really different backgrounds. He was so learned, a great Talmudist, no rabbi could catch him out. But he was not exactly a religious man. He didn't observe all of the commandments, but he was definitely at home in the synagogue. And whenever there was a Jewish gathering, even if they didn't speak a word of Yiddish, he was there. He was amongst the Zionist gatherings. He for a time sympathized with the communists, although he wasn't a communist, and he was at home with the Bundists. This is a still from the wonderful film that you can see for free on the BFI website, Robert Vass's experimental film, The Vanishing Street from 1962. Robert Vass was brought up in Nazi-occupied ghetto in Hungary and moved to London in the 60s and started to film the Jewish East End. And his short documentary, The Vanishing Street, manages to capture the particular Yiddish atmosphere of Hessel Street Market in Whitechapel, just before the developers came in with bulldozers and wrecking balls and pulled the place down. By the time this film was made in the 60s, the Jewish East End was already in serious decline. The glamour of the 1930s had long gone. The place was so badly bombed during the war that most people, like my own grandparents who'd been evacuated, did not want to come back or had nowhere to come back to. Whitechapel was a wasteland filled with bomb sites, abandoned buildings, dusty and ruinous, and the Jewish community were leaving in droves. In 1967, Robert Vass filmed Stencl for a documentary called Belonging for the BBC, which followed the lives of 3 artists. The film opens with the scene of London after midnight in Stepney. And in Whitechapel, he focuses on the Yiddish poet, Stencl. I was so excited to see this film a number of years ago. And as far as I know, and please do correct me if I'm wrong, if anyone else in the audience knows differently, this is the only substantial piece of moving footage of Stencl. These images that I'm showing now are stills from that film. The film shows Stencl wandering around the bustling wide pavement of the Waste in his beloved Whitechapel, wearing a long overcoat and a trilby hat, with a brown package under his arm filled with copies of his magazine. There's another scene of him sitting alone, slightly hunched at home in his small flat in Great Orrick Street, scribbling away with a pencil on paper in Yiddish. He lived in various cheap rented rooms in Whitechapel before being bombed out a number of times during the Blitz. And he finally settled in this council flat in Great Orrick Street, which is just off Brick Lane. And this is where Vass recorded him in the 60s. And here we see him sitting on his bed, table pulled nearby, writing by the light of the window. Vass describes him as shy and withdrawn, content with the bare necessities. Stencl lives in the isolated world of his mother tongue. The camera sweeps around the small room, resting on a chest of drawers, the only other piece of furniture in the bedroom. And on top of a dusty dresser sits a jumble of papers and books, a dead plant pot and a half-empty bottle of something. And beside this, a collection box for Israel next to a pile of books. The camera sweeps round into the small kitchen and then moves into his front room, where we can see piles and piles of books. Every surface is covered, the alcove piled high, the dining table disappeared beneath a layer of books, 10 deep. And on the wall, the only decoration, a single peacock feather and 2 photographs, one of his brother Shlomo, who became a revered rabbi in his hometown, and another of his father, a pious Hasidic Jew. And in Yiddish folklore, the symbol of a peacock feather represents the Jewish people, and attached to the bottom of this feather is a pin with the Hebrew word yizkor, remember. And in the film, we see Stencl as a young man photographed with his mother. And on the mantelpiece, on top of a pile of books, a framed postcard of a painting of Jewish refugees trudging along a road in Europe somewhere, as Stencl mournfully calls out the lines of one of his best-known poems. Lublin, Lodz, Warsaw, your name will always be sacred, places where Jews have been. Stencl arrived in Whitechapel in 1936, the year of the... In Vass's film, clips of the anti-fascist demonstration are cut with scenes of Jewish Whitechapel, which became a refuge for so many Jewish people from other parts of the world. Here is another English translation of a part of one of his poems on this subject. With a needle in his lapel, with wife and child fleeing the Kishinev pogrom, a tailor has come into a foggy street in a dark, tumble-down house. There is an open door where he felt at home, and at each window sings a singer machine led by the press iron's hiss and glow. Jewish workers live here. Do you know where they are from? From a yeshiva in Tel, a carpenter from Blitz, a cobbler who wanted to dispose the Tsar, those smoky houses street thick with fog, where the street lamps with a dull haze burn, a bet midrash or a little synagogue, at each one you hear Jews sit and teach. The Grand Palais, the Yiddish theatre, was still operating when this film was made, despite the fact that most of its former patrons had moved away. Vass shoots a scene of the famous Yiddish actor Maya Zelnicka on stage. And the film states the Grand Palais puts on a play only occasionally, but Stencl clings to his task with almost childish obstinacy. Yiddish must be kept alive. Outside on the streets, the flyers are in Yiddish. The camera moves to the window of a local bookseller, Mazin's, which published many Hebrew and Yiddish books, including a manual of the Yiddish language. There is a scene inside the film of the Whitechapel Library, known back then as the University of the Ghetto. We see shelves and shelves of book in Yiddish, including many of the great classics. My great friend and mentor, the late Bill Fishman, who knew Stencl well, told me the library was known by us all as the University of the Ghetto. We all went. My father would go to read the Yiddish newspapers. For us, literature and history. The Whitechapel Arts Group used to meet in the reference library. Joseph Lefwich told me this. He met Jacob Epstein, the sculptor there, Rosenberg, the poet. It was a marvelous training ground for these young immigrants. They got a higher education there that most couldn't afford. The intellectual elite among the Jewish immigrants met in the library, not in the synagogues. Mark Gertler, Bomberg, the poet Rob Rodker, and Jack Bronowski, the mathematician, scientist and writer, and later the Yiddish writer Stencl. And quite recently, from family members, I was delighted to learn that my grandfather, when he first moved to Whitechapel, one of his first jobs was as the Yiddish librarian there. I wonder if that's where he met Stencl. Most documentary films shot in Spitalfields over the past 30 years include footage of the late Professor Fishman standing on the corner of a Whitechapel street, enthralling a group of students with personal memories of the Battle of Cable Street and anecdotes about the characters and events that make up the area. His walking tours were legendary, and I was very lucky to have met him when I first moved to the area back in 1991. And he taught me most of what I know about the Jewish East End. And I wanted to share with you this wonderful picture here from the Bishopsgate Institute from the 1970s. And here we can see a young Bill and Avram Stencl, and I don't know who the lady is, so if there's anyone in the audience that does know, I would love to hear from you. After Stencl died in 1983, Bill Fishman, along with a Yiddish scholar and another great personal friend of Stencl's, Dovid Katz, who again has helped me with my research a great deal, managed to arrange to have his personal belongings donated to SOAS, the School for Oriental and African Studies near Russell Square. These were donated with the permission of his great niece, Miriam Becker, who I believe is in the room. Miriam and Roy, hello, and thank you both for all your tremendous help and support with this research. It was in fact the librarian at SOAS who put me in touch with Miriam, Stencl's surviving relative. And since then, I'm delighted to say that I've been up to visit Miriam and Roy at their home in Manchester, and they have very generously shared further memories with me. So Miriam, I do hope it's okay with you that I'm going to share some of these today. This is a wonderful picture of Stencl holding Miriam as a baby. And this wonderful memory of hers, of her talking about how he would pull out all of these poems from his pockets to share with her father, his surviving relative. And here is a picture of Miriam at home. And Miriam, if it's all right with you, I'm just going to share a very short audio clip of Miriam talking about her memories of her uncle.
I thought he was quite good looking. He had beautiful pale blue eyes, but always scruffy. Always very scruffy. He had no interesting clothes. He didn't have a lot of money anyway. He used to have an overcoat with big pockets stuffed full of, it was like a very wide toilet paper that he used to write on. It was just long pieces of paper, and he used to just pull them out of his pocket. It was all on a big roll. It wasn't in sheets. I think he got it for free from his publisher, Narrow Press, but he always had his pockets filled with, and he always lost pens. He was always going through lots of pens that he lost. He used to come to our house a lot, and the first thing he did at our house, my father suffered from Parkinson's progressively, but he gave up work in the probably mid-50s. So he was always in the house just sitting in a chair, and my uncle would come in, out of his pocket he would pull all the poems that he'd written for his heft for that month, and he would sit in our dining room and read all the time to my father to see if he approved. And my father used to occasionally correct grammar or spelling or whatever, but I'm not sure he was a poet himself and appreciated the poetry, but he used to sit and listen, and he used to test out his poetry on my father. But that's what he did. Obviously it's a Yiddish speaker who, bright fellow, my father, who was a linguist, so he was probably quite accurate with his Yiddish. So it was someone to test it out on.
Thank you, Miriam, so much, and for sharing these wonderful pictures. And I believe, and again, Miriam, Roy, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a picture of you with Stencl when he used to take you down to Westcliff, Whitechapel on Sea as a child, and you told me these wonderful stories about how he loved the fresh air, and there were many kind of kosher eating places then. And I love the idea that maybe Miriam, as a young child, you might have met up with my grandparents there as well. And here's the wonder of modern technology. I've been trying to write and research about Stencl for such a long time now. And during a previous talk some years ago, her nephew, David, who I believe is also here in the room, who's joined us from Israel, put me in touch with the late Julie Bloom, his aunt, who was Stencl's girlfriend in the 1950s. And he sent me this wonderful picture. And here's a picture of Julie, who I had a fantastic time and visited her many times before she died. And she shared wonderful stories about Stencl in the 50s, and this great photograph of her with him. And here are her memories of Stencl.
Well, he was 23 years older than me. All he was concerned about was walking up down the road, meeting people, writing poetry and selling his poetry and making speeches and talking about the Jewish life, whatever he spoke there. That was his life. And he was very happy with his life. He was satisfied with it. Pretty well known and very well respected. So he had these beautiful blue eyes. I've never seen such blue eyes, absolutely beautiful. And he had this husky voice, but he enjoyed it. You also, when you talked, he'd always have a smile on his face, and Oh, yeah, he adored his mother. Well, he told me she's very beautiful. He truly he loved her. He left home and never saw her again, as far as I know.
David, thank you for putting me in touch with your aunt, who I really enjoyed meeting. As I said before, I've been trying and failing to date to get a book published on Stencl. One of my great stumbling blocks is that, like many people of my generation, I don't speak Yiddish, to my shame. But if this talk has not convinced you why it's important to tell Stencl's story, here's some other reasons why. Since his death in 1983, the Oxford Programme in Yiddish Language and Literature has established the annual Avram Nachum Stencl Lecture in Modern Yiddish Literature in his honour. The late Professor Prava recognised Stencl as a great and complex modern poet. His celebrated volume of poems, Fischerdorf, in German translation in 1931, was highly praised by Thomas Mann, who noted the power of his imagery would arouse envy in even the prose writer. However, Stencl was, as Prava notes, not just a poet and an essayist, but an indefatigable editor who sought to bring together not only his own scattered writings dealing with the London experience, but also those of his Yiddish-speaking contemporaries, chronicling both a historiography of Yiddish literature and the Jewish quarters where he lived and worked. This was a unique trait of his work. He also, as academic Heather Valencia noted, engaged with and wrote about the German environment, which made him different to other Yiddish poets publishing in Berlin at that time. It's amazing to me that the full story of this important Yiddish poet has not been recorded in a book before. And given the large canon of literature on European Yiddish poets and poetry in Yiddish, German, and English, this is an astonishing omission. But for me personally, I think the reason why I'm so fascinated by Stencl is that he epitomizes the idea of the wandering Jew. He lived amongst the ultra-Orthodox Jews of Eastern Europe, the Zionist pioneers of rural Holland, the peasant workers of the German countryside, the bohemian intellectuals of pre-war Berlin, and the great cosmopolitan mix of Jewish tribes who made Whitechapel their home both before and after World War II. During his lifetime, he witnessed the ruination of all these places. His poetry is filled with images of death and loneliness and orphan wandering, connecting both to the destruction of Jewish Europe and then the slow disintegration of Yiddish culture and life in Whitechapel. His story is this story in microcosm. And finally, I will end with this very important quote by the late Professor Prava. He went on writing his poetry, sometimes in despair, but with a steady and sustained flicker of hope that one day his legacy would be found valuable, not to go on, to remain inactive while facing the threatened disappearance of yet another Yiddish-speaking community would be to allow Hitler yet another posthumous triumph. Thank you very much.
Rachel, that was absolutely wonderful. It was the most moving evocation of not just a fascinating man, but also an extraordinary cultural moment. And I really passionately hope that you will get to find the right publisher for this book, because I think it'll be absolutely fascinating. Let me just ask you, if I may, one of the things that sort of struck me was the contrast between that bohemian world in literary world in Berlin, where, as you say, Thomas Mann was an admirer of his. He had a very intense relationship with the great German poet Elsa Lasker-Schüler. He met Kafka and Kafka's last love, Dora Diamant. And then the contrast between that world, the cafe world, the bohemian world, and this old figure in his grey coat with scraps of paper and this bare council flat. It's an extraordinary contrast, and I wonder if you have a sense of what sort of happened in between, apart from obviously being a refugee yet again. But
well, don't forget, I don't know if I made it clear enough in the talk, whilst he was living a very rich cultural life in Berlin, he also lived a very bohemian life. So he was still penniless, you know, sleeping on friends' floors, park benches, but a very, very rich cultural life. As David Katz recently said to me, all the other Yiddish poets were actually quite jealous of him because he didn't care. He didn't care about fame. He didn't care about material things. You know, he went to a cafe in Whitechapel and had a boiled egg and a piece of toast every day. He was so full of his artistic and creative life. And I think that's what really attracted me to him as an artist. He's such an authentic artist. And literally, as soon as he hit the ground running in Whitechapel, and immediately started to set up this very vibrant Yiddish literary life that was all around him. And as Maya Bodansky said, you know, in the early days before the war, these meetings that he created did have the vibrancy of the kind of Berlin meetings. You know, all the famous Yiddish writers, when they came to London, would come and they would contribute to his magazine as well. But it was in later years, I suppose, it became sadder, but he didn't care. He was just so passionate about what he was doing and just carried on doing it anyway. And it's very admirable.
And you mentioned that he lived on selling his pamphlets and later on his pension. But still, I mean, a real Luftmensch. I mean, somebody with, you know, it must have been desperately hard, even in a council flat in the East End, putting together any life.
I think it was hard, but even in his later life, you know, he had a devoted band of followers. I mean, David Katz talked about, even in the 70s and the 80s, how he didn't just have the Saturday afternoon meetings. He would go to a little Italian cafe in the East End on a Friday night, and he was like a guru, and all of his followers would come there and be talking and arguing in Yiddish. You know, he had a rich life. That's very clear to me from the many people I've spoken to now who knew him.
And can you tell us a little bit more about his relationship with Dora Diamant, who, as you say, was, you know, Kafka's last love, who he'd met in Berlin, and then they meet up again in post-war London, or perhaps in wartime London, perhaps. Can you tell us a little bit more about that relationship?
Oh, I can, because I've spoken at length with Kathy Diamant, who has written this wonderful biography of Dora called Kafka's Last Love. And in that, she did quite a lot of research about this. And she talks about this incredible meeting in 1936 that Dora and Stencl held this illegal Yiddish meeting. And they pretended they were having a wedding. And Dora describes it as, I was the bride and he was the groom. And that's how they kind of got away with it. And Dora then left and went to Russia, and he saw her off at the train station in Berlin. And there's this wonderful story that Kathy tells of her kind of pressing her last bit of German money into his hand, said, get that lecture printed, which he did. And then when Dora later came to London, they reignited their friendship, and she was very essential in setting up the Friends of Yiddish.
And do you have any sense at all of his encounters with Kafka in Berlin?
I don't know for sure if he met Kafka. He definitely met Dora, but he was mixing with a huge number of others of the kind of intellectual elite at that time. And his publications, I've put together a bibliography from various places that I can find. And the amount that he published, he was so prolific. And I think this is part of the problem of why he hasn't been maybe recognized enough within the wider canon. I mean, his German publications were extremely highly regarded. You know, over 15 publications in Yiddish and translated into German. But when he came here, he was just publishing all the time. And he was often his own editor as well. So Lauschen Laban is also filled with his memoirs, his stories of what was going on in Jewish Whitechapel at the time. I'm so desperate to read them. I've just made a very big academic application, which unfortunately was unsuccessful, to work with a Yiddish academic to translate this work, because it's very hard to complete this book without it. If there's anyone out there that wants to help me who's a Yiddish speaker, please do let me know.
And can you describe what a copy of Lauschen and Laban looked like? Because you said a pamphlet, so a few pages, or?
I think they varied in size. I should have put a picture of one there. You know, they were kind of smallish pamphlets. I mean, Miriam, who's here, might be able to describe them better, but they varied in size. They were printed at Narod's. They were kind of paper publications of maybe 50 to 100 pages on average, I would imagine, obviously all in Yiddish.
And was he the sole contributor, or were there a whole number of Yiddish writers?
No, not at all. There was many Yiddish writers contributing. And during the height, like I said, during the war, when a lot of the other Yiddish newspapers closed, everyone was publishing in Lauschen Laban.
And before we throw this open to the audience for their questions, can I just finally ask you, what is it that draws you to these extraordinary figures, Rudinsky and now Stencl? Is it they themselves, their stories, or is it that whole East End moment that fascinates you?
I see a lot of parallels in certain ways between David Rudinsky and Stencl. One of the reasons being is both of them, there's a lot of mythology within the East End about these two figures. I heard a lot of stories about them. I never met them. And also, unusually, their entire archive of predominantly ephemera, actually, has been saved. And I think, as Monica will contest, because she knew me first back in the 90s when I was working as an artist, and a lot of my work there back at that time was about my own family, most of whom were lost during the Holocaust, and how there was nothing apart from a single photograph to remember them by. And here we have these stories of ordinary working class Jewish people. Well, I don't know if I'd describe Stencl as working class. You know, he came from a really particular kind of extraordinary, almost like royalty Hasidic background. But he certainly lived a working class poor life in the East End. And I suppose my great passion is to tell these stories. As a Jewish community, we're very good at telling the stories of the really successful people, the Vidal Sassoons, etc., who made it out of those humble backgrounds. But the stories of the ordinary working class Jewish people are less well told, and they're an important part of our cultural history and memory.
Rachel, thank you so much. Let me hand back to Monica, who will be fielding all the questions from our audience. Should there not be enough questions to fill up all our time, I've got loads more, so Monica, do come back to me if you need.
So do I, just in case of need. Thank you so much, Rachel. That was truly wonderful. I have actually, just bearing in mind the relatively low numbers, this is an intimate gathering, which is rather wonderful. And I think rather than people typing in their questions, we should, I think, give people a chance to make themselves visible and audible and ask them themselves. I'll reserve my own questions for the moment, but I have immediately a comment from somebody you may or may not know. It's not quite clear from what she says. Frida Beer, is that a name known to you?
I recognise the name. Frida, we know each other.
Moment of encounter coming up, I think. Wonderful presentation. Thank you, Rachel Lichtenstein. Stencl was my father's first cousin, and I remember him well. He came to all our family functions. I also met his nephew, Miriam's father, and think I saw her as a small baby. Frida, could we ask you to make yourself visible, to turn on your camera and perhaps say a few words? I'm sure that we would all love to see you.
I have actually very, very many memories of Stencl. He did rather frighten me when I was a little girl. He kind of tended to hover over me and only spoke Yiddish, whenever he came, pretended that he didn't actually know English. We were always at the Grand Palais. My parents took me there as a little girl, very little girl. I sat on the floor in the front, and in the interval, we would meet up with Stencl and we would eat schmaltz herring, and just very, very many memories.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Frida. It's really lovely to hear from you. Thank you.
Can we put the two of you in touch with each other?
Yes,
I do hope so.
Rachel, I have actually written to you. I don't know whether you received my letter, but when you asked for memories of Stencl, and also, you may not know this, but Rudinsky's room, I used to do very much reading for years, for 30 years, for the blind, the Jewish blind, and I read Rudinsky's room and have recorded it.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Oh, Frida, do try again, because I haven't had that email. Monica can put you.
I should be able to put the two in direct touch. That's right.
Very good, very good.
Thank you so much.
David Herman, I also wrote an email and didn't actually get a reply because I'm a great admirer of his father's work. Didn't actually know that David was his son. Well, you know, our paths have crossed, so it's wonderful.
Good, well, I'm delighted to be
Thank you very much for this wonderful, wonderful talk.
Lovely. David, talk about your father. Oh, sorry, Mayor. Do you have any memories you'd like to contribute of, you know, your father sort of talking about Stencl at all?
No, I mean, he did love that story of their trip together to the Tate. And he wrote an obituary of Stencl, which if I may just read a few words, because it's quite tricky to track down, actually. It's from 1983 in the Jewish Quarterly. And it begins, emotional, excitable, quarrelsome, often breaking into violent temper, would gesticulate wildly, white spit in the corners of his mouth, would shout things which were both preposterous and ridiculous, like, for instance, when in a quarrel with Itzik Munger, another Yiddish poet in London at that time, he in the pose of an angry prophet yelled, "I will see to it that you never walk the streets of Whitechapel." Yes, all this is true, but there was also another Stencl in the same body, a more significant one. He was poor but never spoke of it. His poverty became a way of his physical and emotional existence. He accepted it. He would go begging to keep up his little magazine, Lauschen and Laban, but asked nothing for himself. He reduced his personal needs to the minimum he could survive on. He would put his own often desperate situation against the others, worse off than him, and would say with a smile, "I'm quite fortunate."
Lovely.
I hope that gets a bit of a flavour of two aspects of Stencl. Anyway.
Absolutely. It's also a reminder, David, I have to say that your father was not only a wonderful visual artist, but a wonderful writer.
Yes, he was.
I mean, fantastic, lovely. I can't believe there aren't any more. David has a question. Can I just also, there's also from Jacqueline, a wonderful talk. Can you point me to publications? You know, where can we now see his work? And I was also, just as a sort of addendum to that, who was he published by in England, and who did the translations? And did he ever write in German, or was it always Yiddish?
Always Yiddish in the UK, but he always wrote in Yiddish, but he's been translated into German. All his publications are available in their first editions to see in the Whitechapel Library. There's a wonderful book, let's see if I can get my hands on it here, that was published a few years ago, translated by Baruah Weingart and Stephen Watts, that uses some of his poems from his Berlin years. I'd really like to invite Roy and Miriam Becker to say a few words, because it's so lovely that you're here in the room with us.
Well, am I muted? No.
No.
Can I just say, I really enjoyed your talk. I thought you summed him up beautifully. And I enjoyed every bit of it. And just to show you, you were asked about his heftelach. I've got a few here, so just examples of the heftelach, and they run to about, I think, 50 pages, roughly 50 pages each, because I know David was asking about it. Thank you for your talk. And Frida, which side of the family are you linked to? Didn't know you existed.
My father was Peretz, came from Poland as well, exactly the same age as Avram Stencl.
Right.
And they often got together. And I think I do remember you. Your father was slightly lame, was he?
Yes.
Yeah,
He had
I
a
remember
shorter
him.
leg.
Yeah, I remember him very, very
So
well.
are you related, did you say?
Well, yes, my father and Stencl were first cousins.
From the mother's side or the father? How did it?
Sadly, I don't know.
It could be we're related.
I think possibly, yes.
It sounds like you are. How wonderful. And Miriam, thank you so much for that, and for showing them, and for all your generosity since we've met.
Well, although I knew him as an uncle and he was always at our house, I'm learning about his life, because as a child you don't ask those questions.
Yeah.
So I find this very interesting.
How often did it come out? Was it regular or just
Monthly? It was every month.
Mm-hmm.
And he had, there's an introduction there showing all the contributors. I know my father used to write for it in the early days, but he obviously had his regular contributors.
I mean, that's really something, isn't it? A monthly publication coming up all through the war, and not only that, continuing for 43 years. And I should also add that the literary group that he set up, which later became known as the Friends of Yiddish, is the longest running literary group in the UK. It only disbanded in 2011. So Maya Bogdansky took over, and then after he died, Chaim Nelson took over, and then it finally disbanded. But that's an incredible achievement, both of those things alone.
Another question about, yes, what translations are available in English? I mean, is it a question of just being lucky enough to stumble upon copies? I mean, you mentioned the Whitechapel Library, but where else might one turn?
David Mazau has just put in a very important link into the chat. Hello, David. Of one of Dovid Katz's articles, where I got a great deal of information. And again, you know, all of this, I never knew Stencl. I'm a kind of gatherer of these stories from those that did. And this is a wonderful article on Stencl from Dovid, who knew him very, very well, which has some further poems translated. They're very scattered at the moment. And I'm hoping very much to be able to, you know, bring them together, but not just that, his incredible life story.
David Mazau, I think you wanted to ask a question. Sorry to have kept you waiting. Why don't you unmute yourself and start talking?
Hi, Monica. Hi, Dave. Rachel, thank you so much. This is just fabulous. It's lovely to see you all virtually. I think just on the last point, hasn't Heike Baruria translated at least one slim volume of Stencl's poetry? Am I wrong in that? But
yes, she has. All My Young Years, it's called. So she's translated that with Stephen Watts, and they're actually currently working on another volume, which hopefully will be published within the next year, of his Whitechapel poems. So I'm very much looking forward to that.
Yeah. I just very quickly mention two things. One is Leonard Praga's book, which you will certainly know, Rachel, on Yiddish culture in Britain, which is a 900-page kind of encyclopedia encyclopedia type book on the whole world of Yiddish culture in the East End and beyond. And just on the Lauschen and Laban periodical, I mean, it is extraordinary. And before he started with Lauschen and Laban, he issued, I think, something like 70 or 80 editions of what he called his heftlach, his notebooks, which were little, even smaller pamphlets than Lauschen and Laban, covering all sorts of aspects of current affairs, the rise of fascism, art, politics, and so on. So his printed legacy is even bigger than Lauschen and Laban, which is an extraordinary thing. But I was really struck by those pictures that you showed of his flat, which I've never seen. And it reminded me first of a prison cell, and secondly of some of the Hasidic homes that I know, where you find no artwork and very little except possibly some family photos. And it's kind of fascinating to think about how he lived, and was that somehow a continuation of the sort of Hasidic world that he grew up in Poland. But I guess my question for you and for David and Monica really is a sort of broader one about what Anglo Jewry makes of people like Stencl and people like David's father and people like Naroditsky, who published Lauschen and Laban and told his sons to keep on publishing it and pay for the printing costs for as long as Stencl was alive, which they did. And, you know, and so many other people, Esther Kreitman, the sister of Bashevis Singer, you know, where are the plaques around London to these people who we consider giants, heroes of Yiddish culture, who had, you know, difficult lives for the most part, but in some sense triumphant lives and extraordinarily creative lives. And it seems as though we sort of rediscover them with every generation, but somehow Anglo Jewry never really finds a way to value them and appreciate them, certainly not in terms of just the sort of obvious things like plaques on the walls of the places they lived at, or, you know, the Pavilion Theatre or the Grand Palais in the East End. And so I'd love to hear you talk about, you know, what it will take to make British Jewry finally acknowledge this extraordinary world of Yiddish culture.
I don't know, David. I've been trying for a really, really long time. You know, that's my kind of passion for the last 30 years or more, to bring these stories to light. There has been recent discussions with Tower Hamlets Council about actually having, you know, a permanent space to celebrate Jewish culture in the East End, because it's just astonishing that there isn't one after all this time as well. And I think it's reflected in the many failed grants and publishing applications that I've put forward for this story for over 20 years. And everyone's always said, this is too niche, who's interested? I don't know.
David, do you want to chip in here?
Well, I was just thinking, you see, I think the problem is once you start talking about some sort of space for Anglo-Jewish culture in the East End, that's, I think, very different from what I understand David to be talking about, which is that particular moment of Yiddish culture in Britain. And another name one could throw in would be the Yiddish poet Itzik Munger before he went to America and then finally to Israel. And I think there has been a way in which, if you know, even if you just read the Jewish Chronicle, in which that Yiddish culture is just it is not considered a respectable part of Anglo-Jewish culture. And I think there would be no problem in getting Tower Hamlets or whoever to get involved with some form of tribute to Anglo-Jewish culture. But that moment of Yiddish culture, it partly goes back to this sort of world of the Germans looking down on the Poles and people like Munger from Czernowitz and Stencl from a small town in Poland. You know, it goes back to that big divide, I think, in some ways. I don't know whether that's in any way a response to you, David, but...
Yeah, just two very quick thoughts. I mean, it's a moment, but it's also a long moment. It goes back to the 1880s and 90s. London was the center of the Yiddish anarchist movement around the world and exported thousands of periodicals to America and elsewhere. So it, you know, has a long history as well. But Rachel, to your point, I wonder if a website might be an alternative to a book. I mean, a book is a great thing, but there, you know, there are some resources that could be added to the work you're doing. And it seems to me, if you can't get a publisher in the short term, thinking about a website on Stencl and his world would be another way to go.
I'm just going to put into the chat here a website that I produced in collaboration with other people last year. Please do have a look at it. It's called Jewish East End Memory Map. And there's a number of memories of Stencl and Bill Fishman and Maya and other people talking. But that really relates to kind of the intangible heritage of the former Jewish East End and places like the Jews Free School and the vapor baths, which have since disappeared, and people talking about it. But even with a website like that, it was an expensive project to put together. But I think I really enjoy working on these kind of digital heritage projects, because that was launched within the first month of lockdown in 2020. And we had over 21,000 hits within the first week, and it brought a great deal of joy to people, kind of listening to those memories and stories. So yes, that is a potential project, but again, needs to be funded for someone to do it. And like I say, my great problem, here am I, third generation, I don't know Yiddish. I'm never going to be able to learn Yiddish well enough to be able to translate Stencl's poetry and look through the great amount of work that he published. I need to work in kind of collaboration with someone like the Yiddish Center, for example.
Sorry, I wonder if I could just interject there. I mean, I think there's a danger of talking about Anglo-Jewry as some, you know, homogenous group, because as somebody who's focused on those more assimilated, affluent Jews, I was talking about, you know, the 1930s, the so-called Hitler emigres, you know, of course, there was considerable, what shall I say, antagonism or suspicion or, you know, reluctance on the part of the established Anglo-Jewish community, you know, sort of the danger of rocking the boat. And ironically, of course, many of those people had come at the turn of the century as part of the Yiddish speaking wave, and then had assimilated, moved to Golders Green, Ilford, wherever, as Rachel was intimating. So I think, you know, one has to be a little bit careful about thinking of it as some sort of completely undifferentiated mass. But I'm just thinking also, Rachel, I was very struck when you were quoting, I think, from Bill Fishman about the University of the Ghetto, the library. And, you know, as an art historian, you know, those names, apart from Stencl, were all names that are very familiar to me, but very much as part of that earlier generation whose parents, in fact, had often come, you know, people like Bomberg and Goettler and Rosenberg. And I just was very curious to know, and it's something I've sort of tried to find out from other people, and nobody seems to have quite an answer, you know, what was 1930s Whitechapel like, given that the kind of flowering, if you like, of, you know, the university, the Whitechapel, as you know, the sort of the ghetto was in the sort of perhaps the first 2 decades or so of the 20th century. You know, by the late 30s, what was Whitechapel like in terms of its Jewish presence and identity? Was it already very different? I mean, had it changed a lot? David, maybe you can answer.
I would say, as far as I know from the memories that I've collected from people, there was still a very rich and vibrant Jewish cultural life during that period.
And do we know also, don't want to hog the conversation, but I'm curious to know, I mean, do we know how many of those who fled from Nazi Europe by their different, you know, complicated trajectories, how many of them actually did end up in Whitechapel as opposed to Northwest 3 or wherever?
I don't have the data for that, but people like my own grandparents were part of that community, and it was relatively large as far as I know.
I'm thinking also the Brunsteins. I'm in touch with Lorna Brunstein, who's an artist herself, the daughter of Esther. And is it Sydney? It's not Sydney, is it? what's his first name, an artist and an actress, and they were part of that 1930s influx. And it's just curious because they tend to get overlooked. I think there's quite, in spite of what you've been saying, I think there's a fair amount of attention certainly paid in the art history world to the likes of Bomberg and Gertler and Rosenberg, but not much to that 1930s influx. Okay, David, you want to just carry on talking? Why don't you say what you...
Sorry, which David?
Oh, sorry, no, I was actually, sorry, looking at this, very confusing. David Mazawa, do you want to just...
Well, I just maybe quickly amplify. I just put a comment in the chat, which I think is true, which is that, of it this way, but actually the Jewish East End of the, maybe not the 1880s, but certainly the 1900s and 1910s, by which time it was reasonably established, and there were a considerable number of business owners and shopkeepers and reasonably wealthy people who lived perhaps around Bow and some of the streets off Brick Lane and elsewhere. Obviously a lot of working class people as well. But by the 1930s, those middle class and wealthier elements had mostly moved out, perhaps maintained premises in the East End, but increasingly didn't live there. And it was a much more working class community, more uniformly working class by the 1930s than it had been in an earlier period, I think. And culturally, it's complicated. There was still a lot of Yiddish theater and Yiddish culture, but again, the Yiddish theaters were struggling by the 20s and 30s already. So I would just say that.
Okay, somebody's pulled me up on my socks. Esther Brunstein, yes, indeed. I did know that she arrived after the war as a Holocaust survivor, so my apologies for that. Sorry, other David, did you want to say something?
Well, I just wanted to say there's a new book out about Anglo-Jewish theatre since the 1950s. And one of the things that's very striking about it is it talks a lot about a kind of mythologization of Whitechapel and the East End in terms of familiar stories about Moseley and Cable Street and so on, which is still, as we know from Corbyn's bit of self-mythologizing, a very resonant kind of moment for many people. But again, what is striking is how absent from these accounts of the East End is that Yiddish cultural world that David was talking about earlier, or rather that it's particularly the refugee Yiddish-speaking cultural world. So there is plenty, of course, about the working class Yiddish-speaking immigrant world, but that seems to be a very different kind of time and a very different kind of cultural world.
Yes, I guess that's what I was getting at. It's that 1930s influx that seems to get overlooked, so very interesting. Yeah. I should have mentioned a message from Stephanie Mortman. Rachel, form a group and put up your own flags as an organization. If no one else will do it, you do it. And somebody, Tilla Brading, has suggested maybe a crowdfunding strategy, maybe?
This all sounds brilliant. If I didn't have a full-time academic job, I would be doing it. Monica, I'm afraid I'm going to have to stop soon because
absolutely, no, indeed, and it's drawing late. Indeed. Last chance to ask a question or two, but if not, perhaps I could just round things up by just two small things. One is that I was rather sorry, although it was a wonderful talk, Rachel, to see that you didn't, in fact, include that fabulous and vivid drawing by Joseph Herman of Avram Stencl. You can find it online, actually, if you just do a Google images search for Joseph Herman, Avram Stencl, it'll come up. It's a fabulous. David, I think you'd agree with me there. And also, Robert Vass is interesting. I knew him before I knew about the Vanishing Street project. He's the creator of the wonderful Refuge England film, which actually is not about the East End specifically, but I always cite it as a later example, but a very vivid evocation of the kind of strangeness, the kind of fascinated alienation with which somebody from elsewhere, in his case from Hungary after 1956, looks upon this country. So it's actually also worth mentioning.
I'm just going to put the link to that film on Hessel Street, which is just absolutely fantastic. You can watch for free into the chat there.
Wonderful. Lovely. Hazel Frankel saying thank you so much, Rachel, for your inspiring presentation. Absolutely seconded there. Good. Lovely. So, David, I don't know if you want to say, David Herman, any words of conclusion or...
No, I just wanted to say, just going back to that charcoal portrait of Stencl, it's now at the Ben-Uri, so it's also on their website as well, if anybody wants to see it.
Good. Lovely. So time, I think, to say goodbye. Thank you all very much for being here. Rachel, we'll keep in touch and good luck with all your endeavours. I'm sure something will come of this. I mean, the material's too rich, too interesting, too important to not come to anything.
Thank you very much, and a particular thanks to Roy and Miriam and to David, Julie's relative from Israel, for joining us, and to everyone else who's contributed. Thank you.
Wonderful. And I will put you in touch with Frida with very great pleasure.
Lovely. Many thanks.
So this event just brings this 2-week series of events that is Outsiders have organised to a close, coinciding, of course, with Refugee Week 2021. We're going to take something of a break, I think a well-earned break over the summer months, except that on the 8th of July, there are 2 very different but interesting events about the Siegel family. Arthur Siegel was a Romanian-born, then Berlin-based painter and educator, sort of a pioneer of art therapy, and his son, Walter, was a rather important pioneering architect. So if you're interested, do look at the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website, and perhaps even better, look in the What's On section. But if you're interested in finding out what's in store later in the year and beyond, do sign up for the newsletter, which you can find at the sort of bottom right of every page on the website. Good. Once again, Rachel, thank you so much. David, thanks so much as ever, and lovely to see the other David too. Be well, everyone, and I hope to see you again. All the best. Good night.